Hello, and welcome to the lecture for Chapter 4. This chapter deals with the established colonies, I suppose we'll say. This is the sort of personality of the colonies now that they've been well and truly established. They're relatively successful. The sort of death rates and things like that have gone down. And you actually start to see development of culture and practice in the various colonies. And you also start to get a glimmer of where things went wrong between the colonies and the empire, the rest of the British Empire as well. And so we have some conflicts. We'll talk about British economic policy and generally colonial life and what sort of things are influencing colonial life in this chapter. So the Restoration government of Charles II, if you recall, in England, there was a civil war. In England, Charles I was deposed by Oliver Cromwell and his parliamentarians. When Oliver Cromwell died, there was a bit of a struggle as to who would take over for him. None of his sons were particularly good leaders, and eventually you get the sort of welcoming of Charles II back as the Restoration government. But that didn't completely resolve political antagonisms. Charles II and his successor, James II, made the attempt to strengthen the crown at the expense of Parliament and to centralize royal authority in the colonies as a kind of extension of that. They neither had very much use for representative government, and they had very little sympathy for colonial assemblies either. The intentions of direct political control first became evident in New York, where James, who was at this time the Duke of York and the proprietor of New York, forbade the assembly to even meet in the colony. Massachusetts was probably the most persistent at defending self-government, and in 1661 the General Court declared Massachusetts to be exempt from all parliamentary laws and royal decrees, except for declarations of war. Charles II didn't appreciate this and hoped to break the power of the Puritan establishment in Massachusetts and carved out a new royal colony in the process, which became New Hampshire, established in 1679. And in 1684, he declared Massachusetts a royal colony and revoked its charter altogether. After Charles II, with the ascension of his brother James to the throne, who became James II, royal centralization in the colonies sped up considerably. In 1686, he consolidated Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and the Plymouth colony into what became known as the Dominion of New England. A couple of years later, he also added New York and New Jersey to that Dominion of New England. He abolished all colonial governments as they existed and appointed a single governor by the name of Edmund Andros to oversee the entire area. He limited the towns to a single annual meeting and strictly enforced rules of religious toleration, especially because religious control of colonies was especially prominent in New England. Those religious leaders also tended to be Puritan in affiliation, which was completely contrary to what James preferred, obviously, given that Oliver Cromwell was also a Puritan. People in England, as well as the colonists, were alarmed by this new direction that James was taking as monarch. Both James and Charles II ignored Parliament, issued decrees quite freely, and were very friendly to Catholics, which was probably one of their biggest failings in Protestant-dominated England. In 1688, James had a son who he decided would be raised Catholic and became heir to the throne at that point. Rather than court the possibility of another Catholic monarch, the Parliament invited James's daughter, Mary, and her husband William of Orange, who was from the Netherlands, to overthrow her father. Everybody was willing to put up with James, as long as it was his daughter, his very strongly Protestant daughter, and her very strongly Protestant husband, who would take over the throne after him. But once he had that son, who he intended to raise Catholic, that was really the sort of catalyst that got the movement going. And the movement became known as the Glorious Revolution. It was motivated by religion, but there was a political element in that as well. Parliament wanted to secure their political authority, which James had been consistently undermining since he came to power, and which Charles II before him had been consistently undermining as well. Parliament had gotten a taste of real authority in the Civil War, and the victory in the Civil War, and wanted to secure that much more firmly. And so, in instituting the Glorious Revolution, they invited William and Mary to come over and be monarchs in England, and the conditions were that they would create a limited monarchy, which would be defined by the English Bill of Rights, which would essentially summarize all of the rights of Englishmen, all of the civil liberties that would be guaranteed to Englishmen. It also meant that Parliament had to be summoned at least annually, and that the monarchs would agree to honor those civil liberties. News of the revolution excited the colonists as well, but well before the news arrived, they had already made moves to arrest Andros and his counselors. William III, as he became known, dismantled the Dominion, but he did try to rein in some of the independent leanings of Massachusetts. In 1691, he created a new charter with a crown-appointed governor. Massachusetts was required to tolerate other Protestant denominations, and property became the basis for voting rights rather than church membership as it had been traditionally. Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire were separated off again. New York enacted their own version of the Glorious Revolution, known as Leisler's Rebellion, where the city militia took command of rundown defenses and called elections for assembly. The leader was eventually tried for treason and hanged, as he refused to allow royal troops access to the fort. He thought that they were still loyal to James II, and so really it was just a giant misunderstanding, because he was personally loyal to William III. Had he realized the troops were as well, then that would have gone off much easier. In Maryland, Lord Baltimore sent a message ordering his colonists to obey William and Mary, but the messenger died en route, and so the colonists staged their own coup, demanding a royal governor and to become a royal colony in order to get away from their Catholic proprietor. If you recall, Maryland was set up by Lord Baltimore, who was a Catholic, and it was intended to be a haven for Catholics, but had a majority Protestant population. And so those majority Protestants sort of seized their opportunity to get away from Baltimore altogether by demanding that they become a royal colony. You also have revolutionary events that completely changed the political climate in the colony. You see reestablished representative governments, but you also see the strengthening of English authority. Encouraging assemblies to work with appointed governors showed that William III expected the elites to identify their interests with those of England rather than the immediate colonies, and he laid the foundation for a system based on voluntary allegiance rather than on force. The Glorious Revolution ushered in about a quarter century of war, both in Europe and in North America. Wars that, for the most part, began in Europe and then bled over into Europe's American colonies. The first of these was known as King William's War. William III led a coalition against France. James III had fled to France in exile when he was overthrown, and he managed to get the French to support him in a bid to retake the throne. And so this is essentially a struggle between England under William III and James II with the support of France. France is sort of the mortal enemy of England at the time, and so are willing to pretty much lend their aid to any cause that will weaken their European rival. This was essentially the first of several wars that were fought on American soil. New York and New England both launched an attack against New France in 1690, aimed at Montreal and Quebec, respectively. Both of them failed, however, and dissolved into a series of border raids against civilians. The Iroquois Confederation bore the bloodiest fighting, as hostilities between them and the French allied natives, the Huron, had been fighting for years, and then they fought for years more, long after the official end of fighting as far as the European powers were concerned. By the end of that fighting, the Iroquois Confederation, was divided into pro-English and pro-French, and then neutrals, those who didn't care either way. Following this dissension, a conference was called, and they agreed upon what became known as the Grand Settlement of 1701, in which the 5 nations of the Iroquois made peace with France and its native allies in exchange for access to furs, and also redefined their alliance with Britain to exclude any kind of military cooperation. So the effect of this is essentially that the Iroquois are determining that they're going to sit out any further European wars that bleed over into the Americas. The second war that entails a bit of colonial participation is known as Queen Anne's War. In 1702, England fights France and Spain in the War for Spanish Succession. It reinforced colonists' awareness that they were militarily actually quite weak. The Iroquois managed to remain neutral, and the French allied natives raided New England towns quite readily. Spanish forces also invaded Carolina and took control of Charlestown. All of the attempts at English sieges and other responses failed utterly, and English forces in Europe, however, had more success. The most important consequence of both of these wars was political. It reinforced the allegiance to post-1689 England as the sort of bastion of Protestantism and civil liberty within the colonies. It reinforced that idea. And it also recognized, or forced the colonists to recognize their dependence on the newly formed United Kingdom of England and Wales, I believe, in 1707. And so at this point, it becomes almost impossible to imagine that in a mere 70-odd years, the English colonies will be demanding the rights of independence. So for about a generation, France, Britain, and Spain managed to hold off on violent conflict and compete almost exclusively economically. Their imperial practices in this period were rooted in the economic idea known as mercantilism. Mercantilism is defines each nation's power as measured by its wealth, especially its wealth in gold. In order to secure wealth, a country needed to maximize the sale of goods abroad and to minimize foreign purchases. Each country sought to produce everything they needed without relying on other nations, while also obliging other nations to buy from them. Generally, how this worked was that the home country would do most of the manufacturing, and the colonies would supply the raw materials as well as provide a market for those manufactured goods to then be sold to. In England, this policy was articulated through a series of navigation acts. The first of these was passed in 1651, and it required that all trade be carried on English, including colonial, ships, which replaced the Dutch shippers that had been doing most of the commerce up to that point. This actually acted as a great boon to the shipbuilding industry in the American colonies. In 1660, a second act was passed, which required certain enumerated commodities to be exported through England or Scotland, and it barred any imports from arriving on non-English ships. So there were certain things that had to first be brought to England. Customs had to be paid on it before it could be shipped off to other customers in other places. In 1663, another act was passed which stipulated that imports to colonies had to arrive via England as well, rather than directly from another country, which meant that it was essentially the same as the Second Act, but going the opposite direction. If, for example, American colonists wanted to buy Dutch tea, for example, the tea would first have to be sent to England. Customs would be paid in England, and then it would be moved to English ships, shipped to the colonies, and the colonists would buy the Dutch tea from English merchants, or English suppliers, really. A fourth act, known as the Molasses Act, was added, which taxed foreign molasses, and that was aimed specifically at protecting the British West Indian sugar plantations and sugar industry against French rivals also in the West Indies. The acts affected the colonial economy in four major ways. The first of these was that it limited imperial trade to English-owned ships with majority English crews. This was actually of a great benefit to the colonies, as I first mentioned, because they were considered English. It laid the foundation for American shipbuilding, as well as the American merchant marine. And you see the growth of the merchant marine diversifying the northern colonial economy. The economy up there becomes now much more commercial rather than agricultural in nature. And it also sped up the move towards urbanization in the north. The second way that it affected the American colonies was through the enumerated exports. The main items that were enumerated were sugar, tobacco, rice, fur, indigo, and naval stores. They did not, however, enumerate things like grain, livestock, fish, lumber, or rum. And about 60% of mainland exports were made up of these non-enumerated articles. American tobacco growers received a monopoly over the British market, which actually ultimately hurt British consumers, but it helped the tobacco industry. It minimized the added costs of landing tobacco and rice in Britain first by refunding the customs duties when it was shipped later onto other countries. So overall, the planters' profits were only reduced by a very small margin. The third way that it affected the American colonies was that it encouraged a certain amount of economic diversification. Parliament used the tax revenues to pay bounties to producers of things like silk, iron, dyes, hemp, lumber, and imposed protective tariffs on imports of these things from other countries so that those industries were able to grow within a sort of protective bubble in the American colonies. They couldn't compete effectively with British manufacturers on things like clothing, but they could produce a lot for their own local consumption. Finally, the colonies were a protected market for low-priced exports from Britain. The steady demand for colonial products spawned a great deal of prosperity. Retail shops started to spring up in cities and on rural crossroads, and colonists were now able to purchase a growing collection of imports. Colonial consumption also spurred British exports to North America, and so it was kind of a win-win for everyone in that way. Mercantilism also gave rise to what became known as a consumer revolution and made Britain the wealthiest nation in the Atlantic world. Economic development in France and Spain and their colonies was far less compared to British advances. New France did become agriculturally self-sufficient and actually was able to export a good deal of wheat to the French West Indies. In Europe, the demand for fur began to decline, but the government expanded trade in that area mainly to retain their native allies against the British, and also to retain a sizable army in New France, which was actually very expensive. The wealthiest colonies for the French were in the West Indies, which produced sugar, with large slave labor forces. They were able to prosper mainly through defiance of mercantilist policies. The idea of mercantilism was that the sugar would be grown and harvested in the colonies, then sent back to refineries in France, where it would be made into usable sugar, so table sugar, and then it would be sold back to the colonies and elsewhere. But a lot of sugar growers began to build their own refineries in defiance of that idea. And many of them also sold to British mainland colonies, who also defied mercantilist policies by buying them directly from the French traders, or the French growers, rather. Spain managed to squander most of the easy wealth that they collected early in their conquests in America, but their economy revived during the 18th century. The revival did not, however, extend to the northern parts of New Spain, New Mexico, Texas, and Florida. The British colonies differed very fundamentally from the French and Spanish ones. All of them practiced sort of mercantilist policies, but the Catholic Church controlled most of the wealth in both France and Spain, and private wealth was inherited and tended to be tied up in land. Whereas in Britain, most of the wealth being invested in the sort of mercantilist economy in Britain was coming from new wealth. It was merchants, it was commercial traders and people like that, where their wealth was actually tied up in their businesses and was much more mobile in that way. They were able to take their wealth and reinvest it back into the economy, which made it much easier for Britain's economy to prosper that way. So the British economic advantage is also reinforced by its demographic edge as compared to France and Spain. By 1700, there were at least 250,000 Europeans and Africans residing in England's colonies, whereas in New France, there was only about 15,000, and in New Spain, there was only about 4,500, most of those in Latin America rather than in North America as well. Early in the 18th century, all three colonial populations at least quadrupled in size. England's colonies boasted of good farmlands, healthy economies, and a willingness to absorb any of Europe's Protestant denominations for the most part. England's colonies also grew faster than even Britain itself, with the ratio going from 20 to 1 in 1700 to 3 to 1 in 1775. Immigration remained important, even though natural increase was the main cause of population growth. Economic hardship in other places in the British Isles, as well as Northern Europe, supplied a steady stream of immigrants to the colonies, one of the largest contingents coming from Ireland. These immigrants that were coming in, though, were overwhelmingly poor, and in fact, Pennsylvania became the most popular destination for many of these immigrants. Between 1718 and 1775, about 50,000 condemned prisoners also arrived, most of them as servants, and a lot of them returned to England at the end of their terms. Most of these condemned prisoners, it's important to note, I think, were of the non-violent variety. Most of them came over because of debts or because of theft, and transportation was preferable to prison, and sometimes even substituted for death sentences. About 140,000 of the sort of newcomers to the English colonies were actually African-born slaves. Slavery was primarily a southern institution, but there were at least 15% who lived north of Maryland, mostly in states like New York and New Jersey, or in colonies rather, like New York and New Jersey. Slaves were far cheaper in Brazil and the Caribbean, and so to economize, planters bought women and maintained at least a minimal health for their slaves, meaning that the majority of slaves in this early period tended to go to the Caribbean islands. It was very difficult, or at least very expensive, to buy a healthy male sort of worker, and so a lot of times American slavery depended on natural increase as well. So they would buy up women and children, and actually attempt to keep them healthy enough to expand the population. Most white colonists benefited from rising living standards in the British colonies, although advantages were enjoyed unevenly. Most of the wealthy inherited their fortunes rather than being self-made men making them themselves, while most of the wealthy, while for the vast majority, personal success was limited and came largely through hard work. Most didn't have enough land to give any to their children once they were married, and so young men quite often had to rent farms in older colonies where farming opportunities were cut off altogether. They often had to turn to the frontier or to urban opportunities or to maritime opportunities, which also further added to the growth of the urban population. The rapid expansion of the colonies also hastened environmental change. Quite often, in order to make land that was suitable for farming, they would remove trees, clear forests in order to create farm plots. Despite the labor, many preferred heavily forested areas where the soil was the most fertile, and they would clear rocks and use them to build walls. Removing trees drove away the forest animals and also attracted grass and seed-eating ones, which could wreak havoc with crops. It also tended to change the way that the weather was experienced. Warmer summers and colder winters were experienced because of the loss of the shield from the trees. It also led to heavier flooding and drier stream beds and more extensive swamps. You see a reduction in the fish population, and constant cultivation further depleted the soil, so that the farmers would experience diminished crops each year that they cultivated. The cities were something of an economic paradox, the key to rising prosperity, but it also held only about 4% of the population. And most were caught by declining opportunity. As prosperity was reaching its height, poverty also spread very rapidly among city residents. The high population, low sanitation environment created a very unhealthy living space. Changing labor practices also contributed to the growth of urban poverty. Employers increasingly only kept laborers on in their businesses as long as business was brisk. But if business slumped off, then laborers would be laid off. In Boston, for example, poor whites in cities would compete for work with slaves, whose masters would rent out their labor, and so often caught the short end of the stick in that competition. Urban poverty became a major problem, and wealth remained very highly concentrated in a select few individuals. Poor women had the fewest opportunities, and poor widows and children looked most frequently to the community for relief. A few colonists benefited disproportionately from the growing wealth of Britain and its empire. Most inherited their advantages or married into similarly wealthy families. Before 1700, the class structure was less obvious in the Americas because the colonies were still developing, and there was still an opportunity for someone to start at the bottom and rise. But as the colonies become much more settled and much more established, the elite, once they became much more prosperous, were able to spend their resources buying up land, servants, and slaves, rather than luxuries, which they could use to reinvest and only increase their wealth later. As incomes rise, they could also display their wealth more obviously, and so you can actually see visually the class distinctions. Also, as the colonies become more established, it becomes much more difficult for someone to come in organically, start at the bottom, and rise to the top. American upper class also attempted to imitate the refinement of upper class Europeans, and so they tended to be quite showy as well. They really were the driving force of the consumer revolution because they wanted to buy the things that made them look as elite as they actually were in their societies. For slaves, economic progress in the colonies meant only that most masters could afford to actually keep them healthy. Masters usually spent just around 40% of the amount paid for the upkeep of indentured servants. Black slaves, or African slaves, worked for a far longer portion of their lives than white indentured servants. children began working as part-time helpers as early as the age of 7, and those who were over 60 were spared hard labor. However, most didn't make it to the age of 60, and so just worked basically until they died. As American-born Creole slaves started to grow in number, you also start to see sharp differences emerging between them and African-born slaves who are carted in to the southern colonies from abroad. Unlike the African slaves, Creole slaves spoke a single language, which was English, and the language that everyone else spoke in the colony for the most part. They were also familiar with their environment, having been born and raised there, and had a much easier sort of rapport with the slave owners than African imports did. They usually, as a result, got diverted to better tasks. However, both African-born and American-born slaves proved to be resourceful at maximizing their opportunities. For example, those that worked in the house would often demand tips from visitors or gifts at holidays and things like that. In rice country in South Carolina, for the most part, tasking was used as the method for sort of work, and that enabled slaves to have a little bit more freedom over how they did their various jobs. Tasking essentially provided them with a list of tasks, and as long as it was done within a certain period of time, then how you did it or when you did it was up to the individual's discretion. It was more tolerable than sort of gang-style work, which is what you would see in the tobacco plantations and then later in the cotton plantations. But it still left them with relatively little free time for themselves. Despite the relative benefits, tensions still tended to run high, especially as the black population in southern colonies began to outpace the white population, and the minority white population turned increasingly to uses of force and fear to control the growing slave population. Large gatherings of any sort were a concern. However, rebellions were relatively rare. That being said, one of the more remarkable slave rebellions happened in 1739 in South Carolina, and it was known as the Stono Rebellion. During this rebellion, you have about 20 Africans who seized guns and ammunition from a store at the Stono River Bridge and began moving through South Carolina. They moved into Charlestown before eventually going on and heading south towards Florida, Florida being something of a haven for escaped slaves. The Spanish actually encouraged it. They started to grow in numbers. There were eventually about 80 who were heading south towards Florida, sort of burning plantations and things that they ran into along the way, and actually killing 20 white citizens of the colony. The rebellion was still relatively short-lived. However, within a day, the group had been surrounded by militia and appropriately dealt with, which of course we mean they were all killed. Slavery and racial tensions were not entirely confined to the plantations either. You have roughly 20% of the population of New York City being made up of enslaved Africans. Slave artisans also worked a lot of times in southern cities, and so were able to enjoy a little bit more liberty than their counterparts on plantations. Slaves in northern cities, for the most part, remained unskilled, and so did factory work, factories being something that are experimented with in the northern colonies, or they would work in shops, but it was largely unskilled labor. Typically, if you were a slave living in a city, you didn't live under the constant eye of your master. They lived apart in neighborhoods of free blacks. And so you at least had the appearance of a bit more personal liberty as far as that went. So, after about a generation of warfare, Europe returned to peace in 1713, which only heightened the imperial ambitions of the three sort of big European powers, Britain, France, and Spain. France was hoping to increase its hold on the Mississippi Valley, and by doing so, to also limit Spain's expansive capabilities as well as Britain's. To that end, they established in 1718 the city of New Orleans to serve as a capital as well as a major port. Their allies in the region were the Choctaws, but in the 1730s, inroads divided them into pro-English and pro-French factions, so they weren't united in their support. Life in New Orleans in this early period was particularly dismal. However, the government was corrupt. Trade couldn't support them solely, the colonists there, and so they had to hunt or fish or gather wild plants or grow gardens just in order to survive. And the common struggle just to get by meant that everyone, whether they were Native American, European colonists, or black slaves, all depended on mutual exchange and cooperation in order to just survive. The Native Americans provided things like corn and tallow and deerskins. The Europeans provided blankets, kettles, axes, guns, livestock, alcohol. The Africans were familiar with cattle, as herding was a common pastime in Africa, and so managed the herds, as well as bringing some native produce from Africa that they were able to grow. The life was a little bit better in the upper Mississippi Valley. More than a third of the population there were enslaved Africans, and their principal export was wheat, but the remoteness of the location limited the effectiveness of their exports. They mainly exported to the West Indies, to French plantations in the West Indies. They were also hoping to counter British movements in the Ohio Valley, and so made some moves there, most notably building forts and towns in the region, Detroit being one of the French-built military posts come town in that area. The French were generally more effective diplomats with regards to Native American relations than the English, but not always, and sometimes their confrontations could be just as violent as the ones with the English. In 1744, French traders were traveling as far as the Rocky Mountains and trading with tribes there for buffalo hides as well as slaves, and this helped to spread much more quickly the popularity of European goods like guns and horses. British expansion was made possible by depopulation and dislocation of Native Americans for the most part. Disease, environmental change, war, political pressure, all of these things served to diminish the Native American population. The Iroquois Confederation accommodated British expansion quite a good deal better than some of their other neighbors did, while also seeking to consolidate their own power among the Native Americans, hopefully, or in the hopes rather, of balancing power a little bit. They managed to forge a series of treaties with several colonies, and in doing so, they helped to subjugate tribes who refused to join with them in the Confederacy and move them off of land that was desired by the English. So it was a very beneficial arrangement for the English settlers. The Iroquois were basically the center native power in the region, and independent of the British, hoped to use that to deflect British expansion from encroaching on their own territory. The British also moved to expand southwards towards Florida, mainly to sort of rankle the Spanish, and the colony of Georgia was established in 1732. It was founded by a gentleman called James Oglethorpe, who intended it as a refuge for honest debtors who might otherwise serve time in prison. And so Georgia was offered as an alternative to a prison sentence. The Board of Trustees for the colony oversaw its administration for roughly 2 decades before it eventually became a royal colony. Originally, it was decreed that there would be no slaves, no alcohol, and no land holdings over 500 acres within the colony, hoping to encourage sort of small yeoman-type farmers in the region. It was also decided that there would be no representative government in Georgia. It would just be run by the trustees. This system dominated for roughly a decade. Savannah was founded in 1733, and in 1740 there was about 2,800 colonists that had arrived. The only problem is that at least half of them were not English at all, and a good majority of them, even the English, were not honest debtors like Oglethorpe wanted to attract. At least half were from places like Germany or Switzerland or Scotland. Oglethorpe was determined to keep slavery out because he felt that it was degrading to Africans, which is a somewhat unique perspective. But he also felt that it made Europeans lazy, and he didn't want to risk any revolts that could be exploited by the Spanish. And especially with Spain being their immediate next-door neighbor, that was something of a concern. He also argued that it undermined the economic position of poor whites, which was who he hoped to attract to Georgia. The plan didn't exactly work out, however. Very few debtors arrived, as I've already said, mainly because it was hard to get released from prison, and the limitations on land and slavery discouraged any other immigrants who weren't imprisoned. They realized that they could grow rice in that region relatively easily, and so facing pressure from planters who were hoping to expand their holdings, their plantations, the ban on acreage was lifted in 1744, and in 1750 the ban on slavery was lifted. And you also have the establishment of a representative assembly in 1750. Spain sought to maintain its North American presence despite its European as well as Native American adversaries, with some limited success. In New Mexico, they awarded grants of 26 square miles if 10 or more families would move in and found a town. These towns were similar to those of early New England, where you had everybody in the town. Everybody had houses in the town. You had a church and a meeting hall and everything there, and then acreage for the families was outside the town and not directly attached to their living space. Ranches radiated out from these sort of clusters of houses and monopolized huge areas of land along the the Rio Grande, River, which blocked any further settlement or establishment of new towns. In 1750, there were 14,000 residents. However, most of those residents were native Pueblo. They established Texas, or established it much more firmly anyways, in order to counter the French influence that was growing on the southern plains. The most prominent center was San Antonio, but the lack of security deterred immigrants from residing there. And by 1760, there were only about 1,200 residents. The dominant power in Texas was actually the Comanche, more so than the Spanish. The position in Florida was slightly better. By 1700, there were roughly 1,500 residents in Florida who traded quite freely with the Creek tribe, and they recruited escaped slaves from Carolina to come into Florida, and there was even a town that was mostly inhabited by escaped slaves. King Charles II of Spain even went so far as to rule that any English-owned slaves would be free in Spanish Florida upon their conversion to Catholicism. After a generation of war, the three rivals enjoyed a generation of peace, but economic rivalry soon prompted the resumption of hostilities between the three powers. The next of these to emerge was King George's War, which began, somewhat humorously, as the War of Jenkins' Ear. Jenkins was a British smuggler who was caught in the Caribbean and had his ear cut off as punishment. The British chose to respond to this pretty extensively, suggesting that it was, of course, mainly an excuse to pick a fight. They launched an assault on Florida, however, they were eventually repulsed. They also launched an assault in Colombia, however, they were eventually repulsed again, with most of the, or at least many of the troops dying from yellow fever. Spain also attacked Georgia, and again, they were repulsed. And all of this fighting merged with a European war, which was the War of Austrian Succession. The battles in the Americas were relatively small and usually involved less than 600 men, usually just sort of attacks and counterattacks on civilians, border raids more often than anything. But there was one major engagement in North America, and it resulted in a group of New Englanders taking control of the French outpost of Louisbourg on the St. Lawrence River. The French, in the meantime, had managed to take control of a British outpost in India. And when a settlement to the war was negotiated, it was agreed that Britain would give Louisbourg back over to the French if the French would give their Indian outposts back over to the British. This, in turn, created a fair amount of suspicion among the colonists that Britain was neglecting them. And the next major engagement that we see in the colonies and in Europe even is the French Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, depending on which perspective you're looking at. And that will happen in the beginning of the 18th century as well. So, shifting gears a little bit, this last half of the chapter is about what life was like in the colonies, public life in the colonies. The most significant political result in the colonies after the Glorious Revolution was the rise of representative assemblies, or the increased importance of representative assemblies. Generally, the crown would appoint the governor, and in most colonies, the governor would then name the council, which acted as a kind of upper house. But after 1689, assemblies governed much more actively, and especially the lower elected houses of the assemblies governed much more actively. When Parliament managed to win supremacy over the monarchy through the establishment of the English Bill of Rights, assemblymen also insisted that the governor's powers were similarly limited in the colonies. The governor maintained a fair amount of power, but they had to be sensitive to the assembly pressures because their income came from the assemblies. The assemblies were responsible for paying them. British policy reinforced that growing importance. The Board of Trade, which was the agency which oversaw American developments, neglected to exercise the full measure of its power, which created something of a power vacuum. This enabled the colonies to become self-governing for the most part and in most respects. And also in most colonies, elite landowners were the dominant force in politics. Outside of New England, the legal requirement was usually tied to land ownership for holding office. And this served to bar roughly 80% of white men from running for office. Very few of them could have afforded to run for office in any case, because generally speaking, office holders were not normally compensated for their service. It was something that you did on the side, and so you had to be able to live or to support yourself along with performing the duties of politician. By the 18th century, standards for voting qualifications were fairly liberal in America compared to other places, even compared to Britain. Everywhere barred women from voting, and everywhere pretty much barred non-whites from voting. 7 colonies had land requirements. This usually barred young men, as well as indentured servants, from political participation. But most white males, by the age of 40, could vote. Participation in politics was at about 45%. Elections were usually called by the governor, and so they weren't held on a regular basis. This tended to isolate individuals who lived in isolated areas. If you weren't near a city or a town, you might not hear about an election in time, or it may just be too difficult for you to get to it in order to cast your vote and participate. Ballots were also open and public at the time, and so if you held a view that was considered unpopular, then that might discourage you from going and talking about it. Usually rural elections were uncontested, meaning you just had one person who ran and they automatically got the job. Competitive politics also first developed mainly in northern cities. Elites would usually align either against the appointed governor or in favor of him, and some even started to court non-elite voters for favor, with the bitterest conflicts being in New York City. This also resulted in something of a landmark case in New York, which discusses the merits of freedom of the press with regards to slander and libel. And it was known as the Zenger trial. Literacy and education, as opposed to land and wealth, also allowed colonists to participate in the transatlantic exchange of ideas and beliefs, commonly referred to, or at least as part of, the Greater Enlightenment movement. The literacy rate was relatively high in New England, thanks to its primary education system, but it was a little more sketchy in other locations. The best educated were undoubtedly among the elite, and a growing number of artisans and farmers. Enlightenment ideals combined confidence in human reason with skepticism towards beliefs that were not founded on logic and science. Newton was a major source of Enlightenment thought, and in fact was concerned with far more than just the sort of gravity of Earth. Other important individuals were people like Galileo, or in politics, people like John Locke, or in economics, people like Adam Smith, who were coming up with new theories. And in fact, John Locke, as well as Adam Smith's ideas, become quite important to the American way of thinking. Benjamin Franklin was, of course, the embodiment of the Enlightenment spirit on this side of the world, I suppose. He was, as I've said in class, born in Boston, migrated to Philadelphia, which was a much more dynamic city. It was growing much more rapidly, and as a result attracted people who shared Franklin's interests and zest for learning. He published Poor Richard's Almanac in 1732, and it was very popular, became a regular publication. And he was able to make his fortune and retire by the age of 42, and thus devote himself to science and public service. He was not only a prolific inventor and public servant, he also organized the American Philosophical Society in 1743, which evolved into an intercolonial society by 1769. And as I mentioned in class, when we talked about Benjamin Franklin, I had a picture of Bon Jovi playing the glass harmonica at the museum that I interned in. And some of you, I will have been able to show the picture. Others, I wasn't. And so that's what the picture on the slide is showing. The contribution of the Enlightenment, though, or at least its greatest contribution in America, was still a ways in the future. Much of our revolutionary ideas are influenced by the Enlightenment, and Americans utilize these ideas as we go about creating, establishing a new nation. At the same time that the Enlightenment is gripping the intellectual elite of America, you also have a series of religious revivals, which became known as the Great Awakening, which rose up to challenge Enlightenment assumptions. Many Americans lacked the comfortable competency of goods and didn't live orderly or predictable lives, and so it made Enlightenment and emphasis on logic and reason somewhat difficult for many Americans to swallow. Earlier generations relied on the wisdom of established authority figures to guide their lives. But by the middle 18th century, the world had changed, and the older authorities were left behind. And the result of this was a widespread spiritual hunger among the ordinary citizenry. In 1739, an outpouring of European Protestant revivalism managed to spread across the Atlantic and into the colonies, and this became what we know as the Great Awakening. It spread across all lines of class, gender, race. It represented an unleashing of anxiety about sin and longing for the assurances of salvation. Answers were quite often conveyed through ministers who appealed to emotion rather than intellect. These revivalist ministers aroused audience by emphasizing the sinfulness of humans and the need for repentance. One of them, John Edwards, describes this relationship in his sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. George Whitefield's American tour inspired thousands to seek salvation, and most of those that were converted were young adults, usually in their 20s. Everywhere this particular gentleman visited, church membership would jump dramatically. The divisions, however, quickly developed, and these were often exacerbated by social and economic tensions. The revivalists tended to court the lower classes, and so lines began to harden between the revivalists, or the New Lights, and the rationalist clergy, traditionalist clergy, or the Old Lights. Among the Anglicans and among the Presbyterians and the Congregationalists, you also see similar divisions. So you have divisions and subdivisions coming into play. The New Lights writers hinted that ministers could not be trusted, and Old Light ministers denounced the revival as a form of madness. Opened unprecedented splits in American Protestantism as well. The Baptists, for instance, came out of this split. And the split was especially bitter in places like Massachusetts and Connecticut, where the church there was established by law. It denied the legal status of new revivalist churches, meaning that Old Light churches were collecting the taxes from New Light church members. Connecticut even went so far as to pass laws that forbade preaching or conducting marriages and expelled New Lights from the legislature. The Great Awakening peaked in 1742, a little later in the southern colonies, but the long-term effects exceeded the immediate impact of the revival. It served to permanently undermine the old churches. 2 colonies even officially established new denominations. The importance of the old churches also waned as the new denominations grew in prominence. The Great Awakening also stimulated the founding of new colleges. King's College, for example, was founded as a New Light Anglican college. It later became Columbia after the Revolution. Princeton was founded by New Light Presbyterians, Brown founded by the Baptists, and Queen's College founded by the Dutch Reformed Church. Queen's College eventually also becoming Rutgers. The revival spread beyond the ranks of white society as well and marked the beginnings of black Protestantism in the Americas. It also attracted a fair number of Native Americans. Despite these breakthroughs, both still faced considerable religious discrimination. It also added to white women's religious prominence. Some of these new denominations granted women the right to speak in churches, which had always been denied by the older ones. And some women were even allowed to lead prayer discussion groups and, by extension, began to become political. Revivals also tended to blur the denominational differences between different Protestant denominations. By emphasizing the need for salvation over minor doctrinal details, revivalism emphasized the commonality to be found in all Protestant denominations and promoted a certain amount of toleration, at least amongst Protestants. It didn't quite extend beyond that.